All right, I think I fixed the problem that we had with the volume yesterday. I'm not entirely sure. I've been sort of doing some tests. I don't think it's exactly where we want it to be, unfortunately. But I don't know what happened. I know the audio was bad yesterday, and I apologize. It was like blaring. The levels were all thrown off. I've tried to adjust the levels. I've tried to mix it differently. I've tried to adjust the levels on the microphone. I don't know what happened to cause this to go wrong. I mean, I did the live post-game show yesterday after the game. Or Tuesday, I guess it was, after the game. And it seemed, I think it was fine. Nobody really said anything, and certainly everybody was mad enough that if there was a problem with the audio during that, live show, I'm sure everyone would have told me. And so it seemed fine, but then directly after the live show ended, I taped yesterday's Morning Pitt, and it came out sounding really bad. So I don't know why that happened. I apologize for that. I don't have a good explanation, but we'll, I'll try to moderate the volume of my voice and try to have a better go of it here today. It's the Thursday edition of the Morning Pit here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I am trying hard not to raise my voice or get too animated on this one, but, sometimes we get fired up. Pitt basketball, we will have a lot of time to talk about Pitt basketball, and we'll continue talking about Pitt basketball, but in the South Side, the Panthers will be going at it for spring practice number 2. We will be, we'll be in the South Side, of course, covering that later this morning, getting all the info and information. How about that? That's what's good about Panther-Lair.com. We give you the info and the information. We'll give you all the insight and intel from today's practice, just like we did after Tuesday's practice. It'll be a non-pad practice today in the South Side, but there'll still be things to see. We made a lot of observations about the offense on Tuesday, as a matter of fact, and that's what we're going to talk about here today, is some things that stood out from the first week of practice, the first practice of practice, really, first practice of camp. And mostly we focused on the offense, kind of kept an eye on the offensive line, kind of kept an eye on Eli Holstein and Julian Duggar and the running backs and the receivers and all of that, and, tight ends, just kind of looking at the offensive guys, because I think we're all particularly interested in them. We'll get more into the defense today, and we'll certainly write about it a lot at Panther-Lair.com, so you can look forward to that. But today, what stood out in the first practice of spring camp? What stood out in the first week of spring camp? We're going to break it all down. Everything that we saw, everything that stood out to us. We put basketball aside for a second, and we'll come back to it for sure. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about with basketball over the next few days, next few weeks, next few months. But for now, let's talk a little spring football. What stood out in the first week of spring camp, first practice of spring camp, right here on the Morning Pit, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, spring camp opened on Tuesday, and I guess I should spend a quick moment talking about Pat Narduzzi's post-practice press conference. We always talk to Narduzzi after practice during the spring, and obviously we all walked into Tuesday with a lot of questions for Pat Narduzzi. We want to ask him about how's Eli Holstein doing? How are the new offensive linemen fitting in? How do you think it's going to develop there? What about the new defensive ends? What about the guys coming back? Desmond Reed and Kyle Lewis. What happened in the final 6 games? What happened in the bowl game? Have you put any, had any new thoughts about that fourth and goal, field goal in the second overtime? I mean, there were lots of questions that we could ask Pat Narduzzi, and we didn't. Because Narduzzi just wanted to talk about the passing of Mason Alexander. And I got to say, I can't fault him for that. I think it was a big, it was a tragedy, obviously, and a big event for this football program, and for everyone involved with it who knew Mason Alexander, who got to know him over the past 2 months. And it was pretty heartfelt, and it was pretty sincere. And, for all that you might want to say about Pat Narduzzi and, what happened in the last 6 games or what's happened in the last 10 years or anything like that, I mean, he's a pretty sincere guy, I think, when it comes to his players. And I think he supports his players. I think he loves his players. I think he cares a lot for his guys. I think this death hit him pretty hard, as you can imagine. And I think the impact on the other players on the team is something that's been very important to him ever since it happened. It's incredibly sad, and I think Narduzzi just wanted to talk about that. I think he wanted us to have some insight on what he thinks and how he's been processing it and how the team has been processing it. So we didn't really get a chance to ask any of those questions. We'll ask, obviously, all those questions today. I hope we get a chance to talk to Narduzzi again, not just assistants and players, although we want to talk to those guys as well. So without any real insight from Pat Narduzzi on Tuesday, and understandably so, we were left to our own devices to watch practice or watch our media viewing window of practice and get an idea of what we're seeing and what's going on. And, the first things first, Eli Holstein's out there on the field. He's participating, he's throwing, he's moving around, looks good. Sometimes his passes go in the dirt, but that happens. Everybody's going to have those. But he also made some really nice passes. You can check out our video right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, our video from practice on Tuesday, and you can see Eli Holstein throwing the ball around a little bit. It's so much rides on Eli Holstein heading into this season, and I think there's reason to be confident about him, reason to be optimistic about his ability to bounce back from that injury that kept him out of the better part of the second half of the season, and ultimately, did a lot of damage to Pitt's success in the season. Just as intrigued, and I mentioned this, I think on Tuesday as we were previewing spring camp, just as intrigued watching Julian Duggar. I said it on Tuesday, I'll say it again, and I'll probably keep saying it, and I imagine the coaches might say it as well, that what Duggar did in that bowl game was more than enough to earn him some extra looks as the number 2 quarterback, potentially to compete with Eli Holstein if Holstein starts to struggle, which I don't imagine will happen. But certainly to serve as the number 2 quarterback, to get some playing time when the opportunity presents itself, either by blowout or injury, or poor performance. But Duggar's a really intriguing guy, and we've been talking about him ever since he committed. We've been talking about him since before he committed. If you can go back and look, probably 2 summers ago, when we as we were sort of chronicling Pitt's pursuit of a quarterback in the recruiting class of 2024, and this guy got away or that guy got away, we said Duggar's right here in the backyard. Maybe he's the guy who will end up being the guy. And he did in that recruiting class. I think he's got a chance to be the guy going forward. So that's interesting and certainly something to keep an eye on. Ideally, you would only see Julian Duggar in, blowouts. Not because of an injury, but given Eli Holstein's playing style, it's probably inevitable that you're going to see him at some point, at least for a few snaps here and there, and potentially for longer, depending on what might happen. Of course, it's all going to come down to those guys in front of him, the offensive line, and we got to see them line up a little bit. We actually have a lot of details on what we saw in our camp report at Panther-Lair.com, so go over and check that out, Panther-Lair.com on the 24/7 Sports Network. But by and large, it's really the quest is twofold this offseason and throughout spring. It's finding your top 5 and then finding that depth. If your top 5 are some combination of Ryan Baer and Kendall Stanley at tackle, B.J. Williams and maybe Keith Gouvier at guard, and Lyndon Cooper at center, who plays behind those guys? It looks like Ryan Coretta might be a backup center. Okay, well, that's one guy. Maybe like a Caleb Holmes, fits in as one of the backup guards. Maybe Tyree could potentially fit in as one of the backup guards. Maybe Jackson Brown could fit in as one of the backup guards. Your backup tackles could be Jeff Percy, the transfer from Michigan, or maybe he competes with Stanley for one of those starting tackle jobs. But either way, you've got sort of a 2 deep there. Isaiah Montgomery or Terrence Enos sort of filling out the backup job behind Ryan Baer. There are options, but you really need to solidify it and find good players. You know what I mean? Find a good quality offensive line that's not just strong in the starting 5, which I think last year's was mostly strong. I don't think it was great, but it was solid and certainly good enough to win football games. And I think we said this going back to training camp in August. That felt okay about their starting 5 of Taylor and Baer and B.J. Williams and at that point, Lyndon Cooper, who had taken over the starting center job from Terrence Moore, and then Ryan Jacoby. That's it. I was drawing a blank on Jacoby's last name. Ryan Jacoby at the other starting guard spot. You felt solid about those starting 5. The problem was you didn't feel great about the depth behind them, not necessarily because you think they're bad players, but because they just didn't have much in the way of experience. This year, the starting 5 should have a lot of experience, and a decent number of the backups should have experience as well. Whoever that ends up being. Even if it's guys like Isaiah Montgomery and Terrence Enos and Jackson Brown, they all got starting opportunities last year. They all got on the field. They played against Clemson, or they played against SMU, or they played against Virginia, or whoever it might have been down the stretch, or Louisville. Those guys, Boston College, those guys got on the field and played after Branson Taylor got hurt. And I think that's really important. That's valuable playing time. that can go a long way in helping a young player develop. He gets on the field and he actually plays. It can do a lot, for your confidence. It can do a lot for your development. And so if you've got those guys to fill in the depth, I think you're ahead of the game of where you were a year ago at this point. And it seems like Pitt should have that. We'll see if that depth gets tested, or maybe when that depth gets tested due to an injury, because those seem to be inevitable at this point. But I do think, they should at least be better off than they were a year ago, which is a positive, right? Moving out to the skill positions, the running back's a funny spot. Derek Davis, I'm not sure when he's going to be back. He suffered an injury late in the season. It's probably going to keep him out for a while. Excuse me. I would think it would keep him out for a while. So you've got Desmond Reed. You've got Juelz Goff. You've got the freshman Ja'Karian Turner. You've got a walk-on who transferred in from East Stroudsburg, who was going to be a receiver, but he's going to play running back for a little while just to help fill out that depth. I think they've got Sinquan Smith coming in. Maybe one more. I lose track. They had so many receivers and running backs that they signed in the recruiting class. I think they have one more coming in. The thing is, when you look at Pitt's running back core right now, the guys that were on the field, not counting Derek Davis not being a part of that group, but they all kind of look like the same guy. They're all sort of built about the same. They're about the same height. They're about the same weight. Desmond Reed and Juelz Goff, for that matter, are a little bit. Best way to say it. They look like they have leg power. They're a little bit thicker in the hind parts. Got those strong legs that they can drive a little bit more. Whereas the younger players, like Ja'Karian Turner, hasn't really developed that strength yet. He hasn't filled in that bulk that you get. Now Juelz Goff largely came in with that. Desmond Reed has had that, and so maybe Turner's just not that kind of guy. But I mean, those are probably the biggest distinguishing factors, physically, when you look at these running backs, is Reed and Goff are they look a little bit stronger in their legs, than Turner looks at this point in his career. I think there's good potential there. I really like Juelz Goff. I'm surprised when people talk about the running back depth and they don't seem all that thrilled about what's behind Desmond Reed. I think Goff can be really good. I think Goff showed some flashes late in the season. I think Goff probably would have played more. I think he was hurt in August last year, and so he didn't, I think that set him back. But I think he could be a really good player. He was really good in high school, and I think he's got a chance to be a really good backup to Desmond Reed, and potentially a guy who could take more work if Reed has to miss time. So I'm kind of bullish on Juelz Goff. I think he's going to be pretty good, and that's your 1-2 punch. Now, I think probably a big part of the concern is that you need more than just a 1-2 punch, and with Derek Davis on the shelf, you don't really have that. Now, it's a debate about how much of anything beyond a 1-2 punch they had last year. And quite frankly, it's a debate about whether they had a 1-2 punch last year, because it was kind of Desmond Reed and everybody else. Understandably so, because he's really good, but it's not like they gave a lot of work to Daniel Carter, to Derek Davis, and certainly to Goff until late in the season when they had to, and Carter and Davis were hurt. So, in an ideal world, your running backs stay healthy. They play all the games, maybe miss some snaps here or there, but they don't miss a whole game. And, the time that Desmond Reed misses is not too much for Juelz Goff to handle. They also work in a bit of a rotation, and those two guys really kind of carry your running game throughout the season. That's in an ideal world. I don't know if that's actually going to pan out. We'll see. But that's the ideal the ideal scenario for Pitt's running backs. At receiver, I think we're going to get really enamored with the new pieces with Deuce Spann and Andy Jean and Blue Hicks coming in from Louisville. We're going to get enamored with those guys. But, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they've got Kenny Johnson on this team. I think Kenny Johnson should be one of the top 5 best players on this team, and he should have a breakout season this year, which, is saying something for a guy who's been involved, who has played. But, I think you could look at, a guy like Bub Means, his second year at Pitt, I think was truly a breakout season. He was really good. over the course of that season, particularly the final 8 games or so in 2023. And so I think it's possible for a guy to have a breakout season even if he's been around for a little while. Kenny Johnson has been around for a little while. He was the number 3 receiver last year. But I think he needs to be and should be and will be the number 1 receiver this year and truly break out and be a big-time player for this offense. We've talked about this a lot, about the volume that Kenny Johnson needs, and they got to get the ball to him, and they have to throw him the ball a lot, which I actually thought was going to happen last year after they threw him the ball a ton in the spring game, but that didn't actually pan out. He was, behind Konate Mumpfield and Raphael Williams in targets. He needs to be ahead of those. Well, I mean, obviously Mumpfield's gone, but he needs to be at the top of the list. Number 1 in targets this year, number 1 in receptions, number 1 in receiving yards, and number 1 in receiving touchdowns needs to be Kenny Johnson. I think he's good enough to have a role like that, and I think he's good enough on his own merit, and he's good enough by comparison to his teammates. So they need to get the ball to Kenny Johnson. He needs to catch a lot of passes, and he needs to make a lot of plays. I think out of the transfers, Andy Jean might be the guy I look at to maybe take the biggest step or have the biggest role. I think he could fit into a 3-receiver set with Kenny Johnson and Raphael Williams. I kind of compared him a little bit to Konate Mumpfield. I think he sort of moves like Konate Mumpfield a little bit, looks like a Konate Mumpfield a little bit physically. Not a lot of production at Florida, but I think he's a promising player and a good athlete who should help this passing game. I don't, obviously the first practice, no pads, just the first 5 periods of which we watched, and we're not going to come out of it with a ton of answers about the state of the offense, but I think we'll sort of periodically update those questions that we have, because we have a lot of questions about this offense, and this offense is facing a lot of questions heading into 2025. So we'll have coverage from spring camp later this morning, right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and of course on Panther-Lair.com. You can also go to Panther-Lair.com, go to the Between Fifth and Forbes message board, and post your question for this week's mailbag. We'll be answering those in the mailbag tomorrow. There's still time now, so get your question in, and we'll answer as many as we can in tomorrow's mailbag. One way or the other, make sure you stay tuned right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Like this video and subscribe, and that way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. Thanks for watching today. I hope you've had a great week so far. Enjoy your Thursday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt mailbag right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.